Hello, folks. I'm Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings. Really psyched to be joined by Willie Terrazas. We haven't connected in some years, and he's got a wonderful recording coming out this Friday on April 8th, 2022, called the Torres Cycle. How's it going, Willie?
Going great. Thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for joining. So, this is really a wonderfully unique and sort of cohesive, almost ritualistic concert experience as it's conceptualized. Maybe you want to talk about how you developed it, and maybe tell our throngs of listeners in YouTube land what a performance of the Torres Cycle would be like if they attended a live gig.
Absolutely. So the first thing that I should say is that it was not planned to be that. I mean, you just described it super beautifully. I hope I can use that in the future. But it actually it came about in a much more random kind of way, and yeah, gradually it became this kind of structured thing that retrospectively I decided to call a cycle. But I first had the idea to do a set of pieces related to the cardinal directions a long time ago. That has been like a fascination of mine since I was a kid. I kind of was always interested in just in geography in general, and like in in noticing the differences between a terrains, or because I grew up by the Pacific Ocean, I was always very aware of where I was, just like by seeing where the sun would set. So that this just, I mean, I became very interested in maps and geography when I was a kid. Um, and so at some point, I had this idea of just doing four pieces, um, and assigning these four pieces for different instrumental families. And it was from the start, it was not clear like which cardinal direction should be which instrumental family. It just was more like an abstract idea. It all started like kind of coming together when I was commissioned a string piece for an ensemble based in Buenos Aires back in 2014. Who are wonderful players. They're called Ensemble Süden, and like all of a sudden it hit me. That's your South, right? Like it's a string only ensemble from Argentina. Like, what is there to think about, right? And so that kind of started things going for me, and it all went from there. And also from the beginning, I wanted these pieces to be, um, heavily featuring improvisation, and also with a kind of like, yeah, lots of agency for the performers, many possibilities. So all of the pieces can work as solos, as duos, trios, any kind of chamber combination, up to large ensembles. And so those were like the musical concepts behind all of the pieces. At some point, I realized that four pieces were not going to be enough, because as I became more and more interested on the cardinal directions, I realized that for many cultures throughout history and geography, four is not enough, and there's a lot of other directions to be considered, and I decided to consider seven, because I decided to incorporate above, below, and center. And so that's kind of like, so it became this three-dimensional thing, which it became this really spatially aware uh, concept in which performers would negotiate, not just interacting with each other and with the audience, but also where the particular place they're playing in, and they get to situate themselves, like almost ritually in a particular space, and like trying to understand what the place needs, right? Both acoustically and in a kind of like quasi ritualistic spiritual way. And so, like, again, this was not there from the start. I just wanted to do some pieces, and incorporating all these kind of new notations that I was exploring, and again providing performers with lots of agency, and featuring lots of improvisation.
Great. No, thanks. Well, maybe should we listen to a little bit of Torre del Sur, the piece that was premiered by the Argentinian ensemble first, and then I'm curious to ask you a bit more about the notation that you used. So on this recording, we're going to hear Ilana Waniuk on violin, I'm going to mangle these, sorry. Mirna Hinrichs on violin, Stephanie Griffin, I know, viola, Peter Coe on cello, and Catherine Schulmeister on bass. Great. Well, would you mind, Willie, talking a little bit about some of the notation and your strategies towards facilitating structural improvisation? I did play that one piece of yours, which seems like an
A
epic
gazillion
ago.
years ago.
Was it only 8 years ago?
No, I said a gazillion
Oh, a
years
zillion years.
ago.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's
No,
probably like
it was
2008
that
or
was
something.
oh my God, that was back.
Ariete, Arete, right?
Yeah, that's right, Ariete. That was I wrote that piece back in 2007, and I think you guys premiered it in
In,
2008. So it's been a
yeah,
long
yeah.
time.
So I mean, I remember some features of your notation from that piece. I don't know if there's any. Obviously, that's a long time ago, and I don't know if there's any connection to your approach there. But I'd be very curious to hear about
That
this particular piece. Yeah.
that was another phase. I mean, there were definitely some features in that notation that ended up transforming in the kind of notation that I do now. But those pieces um, from that time were much more of a phase in which I was exploring different approaches, but quite not getting at what I wanted to get. And so a few years went by before I actually landed on notational strategies that I was completely satisfied with, and which are the ones that I use now. And Torre del Sur was actually one of the first pieces to incorporate that. Not the very first, but maybe maybe 2 years into that. I think the first pieces that I came up with this kind of notation are from 2012. So not a lot. Not a lot of time had gone by. So basically, what I do in these pieces, and here, I mean, this was the very first piece of the cycle. So this back from 2014, and so the notation has refined a lot in the most recent years. So basically, what has happened was that I am getting rid of a lot of information that would kind of get in the way of performers really engaging with interacting with each other. So the notation has become more and more kind of like a set of ideas that just function as a platform to improvise, but the actual music making is less and less mediated by the notation and more by the interaction between players. And Torre del Sur still had a lot of information that in subsequent pieces has been a little bit refined and become a little more practical and less cumbersome. What's a common feature to all of these pieces is the absence of a general score. There's only either individual parts, as in Torre del Sur, and I think the two duels also have individual parts. There's no score. In the case of Torre del Sur is quite particular because there are 5 parts, and the parts feature a free choice of clefs, and so all of the it can be played on any string instrument that uses a bow, and so they can play in any register, choose their clefs. They can change clefs. There's a lot of leeway for performers there, and the 5 parts don't necessarily are thought in any kind of registral structure. So part 5 can be played on a violin, and part 1 can be played on a bass. And for this particular recording, I explained this to the performers, and they insisted to, no, let's just do like, this is how you first thought about it. And so the violins actually play parts 1 and 2, and the viola plays part 3, and so on. But it can actually be played in any kind of combination. And then the other pieces, Torre del Norte for brass, and Torre del Este for percussion, and Torre del Oeste for woodwinds, and the piccolo piece, which is Totem 2. Those pieces, there's just a single part out of which everybody reads. Like, everybody can read out of the same part, which kind of functions as a score, but not in your traditional sense, because people will not necessarily be reading simultaneously. So people will be kind of reading in a kind of like very irregular canon situation. They kind of chase each other, and they can also not read necessarily in a linear way. They can jump, they can go back to stuff, they can skip stuff, they can leave stuff out as well. And especially because all of these materials are meant to be platforms or springboards for improvisation. Once they get started, they don't need to really read anymore. And so there are some chunks of music in the notation that performers choose to read a little bit more, quote unquote, faithfully. That's their decision. And in the case of the brass piece, for instance, most of the performers chose to do that with the long melody that appears at the beginning, but not all of them. And you can really hear that when they're kind of aligning with each other and they're very close to each other. You get a sense that everybody's walking the same path, but not really at the same time. Kind of in life, right? Like, we walk alongside each other, but we all have our own rhythm of walking, our own ways of connecting to the world. And there's a moment where this crossroads comes, and people just like go their separate ways, and they interact in completely unpredictable manners. And that's kind of one of the underlying kind of more conceptual or even philosophical kind of ideas of these pieces, that we can be sometimes together, we can aim to be one. For instance, so the 3 totem pieces are meant to be conceived kind of like subset, like a minor trilogy in which I explore how to become one, how to ignore each other completely and just coexist in time and space, and how to yeah, be one from the start. So in other words, be one, be two, or be two that comes into one. And those are the three totem pieces. The totem one, which is the oboe and percussion duo, is two parts that are completely disconnected from each other, and it's just like they walk by. And there's a moment in the piece where they kind of acknowledge that the other's there, and they just kind of go by. And then the piccolo piece, of course, is like it's just a single complex being that's just meant to be one from the beginning to end. And then the trumpet and bass duo is more like two things that are separate, kind of merging into one entity.
Very cool. Let's listen to one of those totems. Which do you think? Would you prefer to elucidate the sort of one thread idea that happens in the piccolo piece, or the more independent relationship in the oboe percussion, or the
I
merge?
mean, I love all three, but maybe
Sure.
if this is going to be like a short fragment, maybe
Yeah.
the third one, the trumpet and bass duo, just because it has such a strong beginning, really like it's all
Yeah.
badassery
Let's
there.
let's
I
listen to
think
the
that could be
beginning
cool.
of Totem 3. Uh, Estoy en el centro, and it's Alexandria Smith on trumpet and Catherine Schulmeister on bass again. Very cool. Well, one of the things I was thinking about while you were speaking was that some of your ideas about the notation that facilitates a certain kind of freedom reminded me a bit of some Christian Wolf exercises, and also Braxton's sort of variable clef type idea. Uh, were those guys at all? Was their work in your mind at all, or it's sort of just a coincidence?
It's kind of a coincidence because I when I first started notating pieces using this idea of like the free choice of clef, um, I was completely unaware of. I've never looked at Braxton's score. I've never looked at the Christian Wolf score with this characteristics. So I had no idea that that was going on. And years later, when I knew uh, scores by them and other people who have had similar approaches, I just was blown away that there were other people, and of course, much older than I am. Now that not that I'm young at all, but but there's older people, that were exploring these kinds of things, and that was just blew my mind completely. And I was, I had been definitely aware of some of both Braxton's and Wolf's music since I was a teenager, but I had never actually looked at scores. I mean, it's not so easy to come by Anthony Braxton's scores. You probably know that, but later on, I did realize that there were a lot of similarities here, and I mean, yeah, these are of course musicians that have inspired me for a long time, but not in this kind of particular way.
Yeah. Well, and also, I guess I would add that one thing at least in my experience with both of those composers, and I may just not have been exposed to music that doesn't demonstrate this characteristic, but both of their pieces, in some form or another, continue to progress from left to right without the possibility of doubling back or jumping off altogether. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, Braxton has these moments where you can vamp as long as you want, or you could take it to a different sort of like supportive materials type of thing, you know, ghost trance music or whatever. And
Right.
Wolf, you can do the kind of messy canon that you were trying to sort of talking about, where everybody's reading like an individual line, but at different. But I'm not, unless I'm not just not aware. I'm not aware that either of those composers have music where you could just fixate on one moment, or even go back, or maybe even just take it into a different place altogether. I think the idea is that you're still more or less moving along the progression of their linear layout, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm not. I don't think any of the pieces in the Torres cycle is, except for Torre del Oeste, which is a little bit different. Although we decided to record it kind of like mostly following what I wrote from left to right. But that is a piece that can definitely work more of as kind of like a modular approach.
Yeah.
But other pieces, other composition projects do have this approach of mine that do have this approach of like you're able to like take stuff from everywhere.
Or start
Um,
anywhere you want, or like, you know.
yeah, and that I mean that in a sense that is a little bit riskier
Sure.
because you it can go all sorts of wrong or all sorts of right.
Yeah.
Um, but but in my experience, what that does is that with the right performer, that can really bloom into something absolutely unexpected and wonderful because
Sure.
it becomes this kind of labyrinth improvisatory situation where anything, literally anything can happen.
Yeah.
With the Torres cycle, I was a little bit more interested in providing the general framework of temporality for to evoke the idea of ritual, and that is why the order that I came up for the CD is that would be the actual order for a live full performance, which hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, it'll happen. But and the idea is to do this. Well, first of all, to start north and like kind of go in a like a clockwise fashion, right? So you do north, then you do the first totem, which is below, and then you go east, and then you go up, and then you go south, and then center, and then finally west. And the idea of finishing up west is is inspired by basically by Taoist thinking. I have been very much interested in Taoism for a long time, and it's this idea of Lao Tzu just hopping on an ox. This is legend. Like he was fed with the world, but he was fed up with the world. I'm done with humans. I'm just like go west, never to return. And so he hops on this ox, and he stopped at the border, right, by this officer, and the officer is like, Master, why are you leaving? Like, where is it you're going? And he's like, you know what? I don't want to know anything. Like, I'm done with humans. I'm just like, and so the guard tells him, well, before you go, would you share your wisdom with us? And so he like took ink and paper, and Lao Tzu like dictated the Tao Te Ching to this guy, and that's the legend, like, and he goes never to return. And so to me, looking west, because I grew up by the Pacific Ocean, looking west means looking where the sun dies every day, right? And where where this is my favorite view ever. I just all of my life I have been watching the sun die in the ocean, and that's just like a huge part of my life. And so I wanted the cycle to end with this idea of the long journey, the long journey that we all are gonna do at some point, never to return, and to like be that, conceive that as a kind of like a very energetic last kind of burst of the last moments in life, and then like just peacefully disappearing into the ocean. And that's kind of how the cycle kind of goes from all of these different stages. And that's why the order was really important. The underlying order was particularly important in this piece, even though the notation definitely allows for a lot of freedom for performers.
Right, but the structural relationship is intact. Yeah, that's very interesting. Though in the notes, I think a very interesting point was sort of brought up with this idea that, I mean, you keep on mentioning looking out to the west, to the Pacific, and so I grew up here in the New York area, and for me, the east is always where the water is. And every time I go to California, it's like, it takes me a couple days to
Right.
orient myself because I'm always thinking like, wait, what's it doing over there? Uh, and the idea that somehow part of the ritual here of the organization of all these different movements and the experience of this concert is to sort of drive home the idea that everything, meaning for us is dependent on where you stand, right? The ocean for me is east. The ocean for you is west.
Right.
And that the interrelationships between these cardinal directions and the musical sort of ritual that's accompanying them can also have that kind of, if you're in Torre del Este and then you're listening, sort of thinking back towards Del Sur, it sounds different than if you were sort of thinking from Del Norte, I guess.
Absolutely. No, this is true, and it's kind of the one of the intentions here to make us think about these things, and to realize where we are and why we are needed where we are, if that's the case, right? And to yeah, to be aware, to have the intention of doing something where you are, to relate, to act in consequence, to be coherent with whatever it is that you are, and
Wow.
to act according to that place's needs. And the inspiration here is, I mean, it's manifold. I already was talking about Taoism, but it also something that really inspires me is a lot of indigenous epistemologies and cosmogonies from Mexico. For instance, the Wirarica people from Western Mexico, their north is our west.
Wow.
They're completely like, like how many degrees is that? Like 90 degrees.
100 degrees,
Uh,
yeah.
and so that's so interesting because the way they conceive their place, their land, and the way they connect to their land, um, needs their north to be the ocean.
Sure.
And so it makes complete sense because they go to the ocean to fish and acquire important things, and they come back in the center, their center, and they do this annual migration for their south, which is the desert, which would be our east. And so
Right.
they go there, they walk, or they used to walk. Nowadays they drive, and they go there and collect peyote, and then do their ceremonies for their deities, mainly the deer god, which is their main god. And all of that happens in our east, which is their south. And so, yeah, when I started realizing how humans connect to the cardinal directions, it started ringing all these bells to me. Like, why is it important? Why is it important to me to acknowledge that the sun sets west and that is the ocean, and what the meaning of that, and why is all, a lot of my musical work has connected to that, and I started wondering.
Mm.
And there's the brilliant notes that were written by my colleague Amy Simini, who is fantastic, kind of bring all these ideas together. And she did the same thing. Like she talks about this in the liner notes. Like she went, like tried to emulate the ritual. And this all goes back to many, many, many years ago when I was first confronted to this in this concert where some of the players, it was a gig that I was hired to do to play flute, but it was with this percussion ensemble, and they were enacting this kind of ritualistic work of them, and they this idea of the salutation to the four cardinal directions, and I started seeing that everywhere I went. Like I started seeing that in a lot of situations in indigenous cultures throughout Mexico, and influencing other parts of Mexican life, like how you situate stuff, how the towns are designed, how people orient themselves. We have a way of connecting to the places that we love, or the places that we work in, or the places that we aspire to become something, or the places that we care so much about, and so we want to protect them, or whatever it is that moves us, it's always connected to place, right? And it's always so in other words, indigenous epistemologists have this idea of always being landed, always being grounded. Everything they care about has a counterpoint in land itself. They don't speculate elsewhere. They don't, whatever they do is not, they don't have this kind of like universal aspiration as in Western culture that kind of detaches us from where we are. And like it's not that easy for someone who is grounded in a place to just move elsewhere, or to connect so deeply to other places. Does that make sense? So
Sure.
I think that's the underlying, core idea of this of the cycle of pieces.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I mean, it's fascinating. It's sort of, there's so many different dimensions to sort of listen to this and absorb this. And I think also, what you're saying, I mean, that this anecdote about the indigenous group that sees the Pacific as north, uh, and the idea that we've sort of universally like imposed this other sort of set of understanding directions. But it really suggests to me that like now that you've sort of set up this cycle, these movements are in a way sort of interdependent. Without, I mean, that's not to say I'm sure if you could have them performed independently, but there's a sense of wholeness that you would get from going around the whole horn, and from reconceptualizing what, if North, the first movement on the CD, is a different direction for different people, that's sort of, there's something very interesting about that also.
They should play it in a different order then.
Yeah, but that's a cool idea too. Yeah. Well, anyway, let's listen to a little bit of the final movement with some of this in mind. So this is Torre del Oeste. You're playing flute, Juliana Gaona, oboe and English horn, Madison Greenstone on clarinet, and Anthony Burr on bass clarinet. Well, it's so wonderful to be able to hear your thoughts on this more at length, Willie, and really animates my experience of listening. I'm looking forward to sitting down with the recording again with some of these ideas in mind. Before we forget, let's make sure to mention some of the other people involved in the project. Uh, Recorded by Andrew Muncie at Studios A and B, Warren Lecture Hall at UCSD. But did you want? I mean, this was like since it was a pandemic project, there were a lot of threads, right?
Yes, a lot of people is involved in this project because well, I mean, I wanted a lot of people to play in it, but a lot of people had to record. Some of the players kind of recorded themselves at home. We had to record basically one person at a time.
Wow.
And so, all of these are ensemble pieces, and so it was quite the experience. I mean, it also, the flexibility of the notation allows for this to happen. So
Yeah, but
it
I have to say
actually,
that like I didn't realize that. It certainly does not sound that way. It really does sound, very interactive and like everybody's in the same room. So
so
kudos
that's
to
why
everybody.
there's a lot of people who recorded additionally. So Andrew Muncie, who is our recording engineer here at UCSD, he did maybe 50% of the recording.
Yeah,
But there's additional recording by other people,
yeah,
Michael Butler, Filiberto Villavicencio, Sarah Bell Reed, who recorded herself, she's a trumpet player, Weston Olenki, who's a trombonist,
sure.
Berg Schneider, also Maddie Barbier, then MB Gordy, who recorded one of the percussionists, Corey Hills in LA, Ryan Strever, of course, in New York, recorded Stephanie Griffin
Oh,
on
right.
the viola, and then Alexandra Smith recorded herself playing the trumpet. So a lot of people recorded. Yeah, and mixing and mastering was by Ramon Del Buey, who works in Mexico City. He's been my trusted engineer for a long time. We've worked many times together. And then the cover art is also by Esther Gámez Rubio, who is another longtime collaborator of mine. She's a wonderful visual artist based in Ensenada, my hometown, and so she understands what I do very well, and she came up with this beautiful thing that it's just even if you don't like the music, this is totally worth it, right? I mean, it's just
Yeah,
so beautiful to look at,
it really
and
captures the spirit of the album and the piece. Yeah.
absolutely. And then finally, the liner notes are by Amy Simini, who is my colleague here, a wonderful person and musicologist, who again I think really connected to the project.
Yeah, beautiful liner notes. Great. Well, this was a pleasure. And it'll be out this Friday, April 8th, 2022. All the places you'd expect to find our releases. You can check it out on Bandcamp, on our own site. Uh, it's available in CD format, online retailers, as well as digital platforms. Thanks again, Willie. Great to see you and great to chat, and hope to see you in person soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Bye.